For 6 months, she'd walked into classrooms where teenagers barely looked up from their phones. Mrs. Sarah Mitchell was just another substitute teacher, the kind students ignored and regular teachers forgot about. She wore simple cardigans, graded papers quietly, and never raised her voice above a whisper. But when gunshots echoed through Lincoln High School at 2:15 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, and a masked figure appeared in her classroom doorway with an AR-15, he made one fatal mistake. He looked at the woman behind the desk and assumed she was defenseless. He never noticed the small pin on her cardigan lapel, a tiny silver badge that only a few people in the world would recognize. And he had no idea that before she was teaching algebra, she was the deadliest sniper in Marine Corps history. Welcome to the Warriors Channel. Before we begin this tale of hidden courage and split-second decisions, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you believe that heroes sometimes wear cardigans instead of uniforms, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who protect us in ways we never see coming. Lincoln High School sat on Maple Street like a red brick fortress, its windows reflecting the autumn sun as students shuffled between classes with the eternal teenage mixture of boredom and barely contained energy. It was the kind of school where nothing much happened. Homecoming games, prom committees, the occasional food fight in the cafeteria. Safe, predictable, ordinary. Room 237 was on the second floor, overlooking the parking lot where yellow buses waited to carry students home to suburban safety. It was a standard classroom, 30 desks arranged in neat rows, a whiteboard covered with algebra equations, and motivational posters that had been there so long nobody read them anymore. Sarah Mitchell had been teaching in that room for 6 months, covering for Mrs. Henderson, who was on extended medical leave. At 42 years old, she was unremarkable in every way that mattered to teenagers. Average height, brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wire-rimmed glasses that made her look like every substitute teacher in every movie they'd ever seen. The students in her third-period algebra class barely acknowledged her existence. She was just another adult who showed up, wrote problems on the board, and disappeared at the end of the day. They didn't know her first name, didn't care about her weekend plans, and certainly didn't ask where she'd worked before Lincoln High, which was exactly how Sarah wanted it. What they didn't know was that Sarah Mitchell wasn't her real name. What they didn't know was that the reason she always sat with her back to the wall and her eyes on the door wasn't nervousness. It was training. What they didn't know was that the small silver pin on her cardigan, barely visible unless you were looking for it, was a Marine Corps sniper badge. And what they definitely didn't know was that their quiet substitute teacher held records that were still classified in places that didn't officially exist. The morning of November 15th had started like every other Tuesday. Sarah arrived at 7:30 a.m., set up her lesson plan, and prepared for another day of teaching quadratic equations to students who would rather be anywhere else. Third period began at 1:45 p.m. with 28 sophomores filing in with their usual mixture of groans and eye rolls. "All right, everyone," Sarah said in her soft voice. "Please take out your homework from last night. We're going to review problems 15 through 20 before we move on to factoring." The usual chorus of complaints followed. "Mrs. Mitchell, I forgot my homework at home." "My printer broke." "I didn't understand number 17." Sarah handled each excuse with patient professionalism, the way she'd learned to handle everything else in her civilian life, quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention to herself. She was writing the first problem on the whiteboard when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong in a high school on a Tuesday afternoon, a sound that made her hand freeze halfway through, drawing a parabola. Gunfire. 3 shots, rapid succession, coming from somewhere near the main office. For a split second, the classroom continued as if nothing had happened. A few students looked up from their phones, confused. Someone laughed, thinking it was construction noise or a car backfiring in the parking lot. But Sarah knew better. Sarah had heard that sound in places where it meant someone wasn't going home. "Everyone get down," she said, her voice still calm, but carrying a new authority that made 28 teenagers stop what they were doing and look at her. "Behind the desks. Now." "Mrs. Mitchell, what's—" started Jessica, a sophomore who sat in the front row. "Now." The word cut through the air like a blade. Sarah was already moving toward her desk, her mind shifting into a mode she hadn't accessed in 4 years. The lockdown procedures she'd memorized when she started working at Lincoln were designed for administrators and police officers. They weren't designed for someone like her. She pulled her cell phone from her desk drawer and dialed 911 with one hand, while reaching deeper into the drawer with the other. Past the extra pencils and grade books, past the aspirin and reading glasses, to something wrapped in soft cloth that violated every school policy ever written. 911, what's your emergency? This is Sarah Mitchell at Lincoln High School, room 237. We have an active shooter in the building. Shots fired near the main office. I have 28 students with me. Ma'am, we're dispatching units now. Lock your door, turn off the lights, and keep everyone quiet until help arrives. Sarah was already moving. Door locked, lights off, but she wasn't hiding behind her desk like the emergency manual suggested. She was unwrapping the Remington 700 that she'd kept in her desk for 6 months, hoping she'd never need it, but knowing that hope wasn't a strategy. The students were crouched behind desks, some crying, some whispering prayers, all of them looking at their substitute teacher like they were seeing her for the first time. And maybe they were. "Mrs. Mitchell," whispered Tyler, the class clown who'd never taken anything seriously in his life. "What is that?" Sarah was checking the rifle with movements so practiced they were automatic. Chamber clear, safety on, scope zeroed for 50 yards. "This is what's going to keep you alive," she said, without looking at him. More gunshots echoed through the hallway, closer now. Sarah could hear screaming, running footsteps, the sound of doors slamming, and underneath it all, the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone moving through the school with purpose. She positioned herself at the window that faced the hallway, using the wall for cover while maintaining a clear line of sight to the classroom door. The rifle felt familiar in her hands, like coming home after a long absence. For 4 years, she'd tried to forget what it felt like to hold a weapon, to calculate wind speed and bullet drop, to make decisions measured in heartbeats and milliseconds. But some things you never really forget. "Is everyone behind cover?" she asked, without taking her eyes off the hallway. A chorus of terrified yes answers came from behind the desks. "Good. Stay down, stay quiet, and no matter what happens, don't move until I tell you to." Through the small window in the classroom door, Sarah could see into the hallway. Emergency lights were flashing, casting everything in an eerie red glow. She could hear the shooter moving systematically from room to room, trying doors, looking for targets. Room 235, locked. Room 236, locked. Room 237 was next. Sarah controlled her breathing the way she'd been trained 8 years ago in a different life. In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. Her heart rate slowed, her vision sharpened, her hands stopped shaking. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because fear was just another variable to calculate and control. The door handle turned. When it didn't open, the figure outside tried again, more forcefully. Sarah could see him now through the window, tall, thin, wearing black clothing and a tactical vest, carrying an AR-15 like he'd watched too many movies and thought he knew how to use it. He raised the rifle toward the door lock. That's when Sarah made her decision. The classroom window was old, the kind with metal frames and thick glass that would distort a shot, but it would also muffle the sound of breaking glass, and Sarah had made more difficult shots under worse conditions. The range was less than 20 feet. For someone who had once eliminated a target at 847 yards in a sandstorm outside Fallujah, this was practically point blank. She lined up the shot with the precision of someone who had never missed when it mattered. The crosshairs settled on center mass. Her finger found the trigger. But then the shooter did something unexpected. He stopped trying to break down the door and stepped back, looking directly at the window where Sarah was positioned. For a moment, their eyes met through the glass. He couldn't see much of her, just a figure in the shadows behind the window. But something made him pause. Maybe it was the way she held herself. Maybe it was the absolute stillness that surrounded her. Or maybe it was the tiny reflection of light off her scope that told him he wasn't looking at a terrified teacher hiding behind a desk. He raised his weapon toward the window. Sarah fired first. The window exploded in a shower of glass and metal, but Sarah was already moving. The shot had been perfect. Center mass, instantly fatal, but in a school environment, you didn't take chances. She was out the classroom door before the shooter's body hit the ground, rifle ready, moving with the kind of smooth efficiency that comes from years of training and experience. The hallway was chaos. Students were screaming from locked classrooms. Emergency alarms were blaring, and somewhere in the distance, sirens were getting closer. But the immediate threat was over. Sarah checked the shooter's pulse, a formality since she knew her own work, and secured his weapon. Then she keyed her phone to call 911 again. "This is Sarah Mitchell, room 237. Threat neutralized, one shooter down. I need medical teams for potential casualties and law enforcement to secure the scene. Ma'am, did you say threat neutralized? Are you law enforcement?" Sarah looked down at the small silver pin on her cardigan, now visible in the emergency lighting. "Former Marine sniper, Gunnery Sergeant Sarah Morrison. Retired. The students in my classroom are safe." When the first police officers arrived 3 minutes later, they found Sarah Mitchell sitting calmly on the floor next to the neutralized threat, her rifle disassembled and laid out for inspection. 28 terrified but unharmed students were still crouched behind desks in room 237, staring at their substitute teacher like they were seeing a completely different person, which, in many ways, they were. The investigation that followed revealed that Sarah, Ghost Morrison, had been one of the Marine Corps' most effective snipers, with a confirmed kill count that was still classified. She had served 3 tours in Iraq and 2 in Afghanistan, earning a Purple Heart, 2 Bronze Stars, and the kind of commendations that came with missions she couldn't talk about even in retirement. She had left the military 4 years earlier after her husband, also a Marine, was killed by an IED outside Kandahar. Unable to face another deployment without him, she had quietly retired and tried to disappear into civilian life. The substitute teaching job was supposed to be temporary, a way to pay bills while she figured out what came next. She never expected to need her old skills again. The media coverage was intense, but brief. Substitute teacher stops school shooting? Former Marine sniper saves students. Hero teacher's military past revealed. Sarah declined all interview requests and asked the school district to release as little information as possible about her background. She went back to teaching the following week. The students in room 237 never looked at her the same way again. They sat up straighter when she entered the room. They listened when she spoke. They called her ma'am instead of Mrs. Mitchell, and not because they were required to. Word spread through the school, as word always does among teenagers. The boring substitute teacher in room 237 wasn't boring at all. She was something else entirely, something that made them feel safer just knowing she was there. Sarah handled the attention the same way she handled everything else, quietly, professionally, without seeking credit or recognition. She went back to teaching algebra, grading papers, and maintaining the peaceful routine she'd built for herself. But she kept the rifle in her desk drawer, not because she was paranoid, but because she understood something that most people never learn. Evil doesn't announce itself. It doesn't make appointments or follow schedules. It shows up when you least expect it, targeting the innocent and the defenseless. And sometimes the only thing standing between evil and innocence is someone who looks ordinary, who blends into the background, who seems like just another face in the crowd, someone who wears a cardigan instead of camouflage, someone who teaches algebra instead of military tactics, someone who has never forgotten that when the moment comes to stand between the wolves and the sheep, you don't hesitate. You just do what needs to be done. Because that's what Marines do. That's what teachers do. And sometimes, when you're lucky enough to be both, you get to save 28 kids who will never know how close they came to not going home that day. Sarah Mitchell went back to being a substitute teacher. But her students, all of them, in every classroom she entered after that day, knew they were being taught by someone special. Someone who had proven that heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear cardigans and teach you how to solve for X. And sometimes, when it matters most, they solve for you. Semper Fi.